Oh, hey.
Thank you. Shall I do a song now? Good morning, everyone. How are you all? Thanks for coming down. It's the weather's not great. It's very pretty though. Very pretty. Quick drink first, then we'll get started. You all going to get home tonight? Like if this happened in Britain, we'd be stuck. We just don't know how to deal with the snow. Before I start, I'd just like to thank STG and SAE and the British Council for making this happen and bringing me over to chat to you and hang out with musicians over here and have some fun and spend a few days in the studio and have fun at the jam night last night. Was anyone there last night? No? Oh, you missed a good night. It was a lot of fun. I even dusted off the sticks and played some drums, which was quite fun. But so what we're going to do today, I'm going to split this. It's quite a long seminar, so I'm going to split it into two sections. The first half, I'm going to do a lot of question and answer stuff, give you a bit of background into my history as a producer, and just have some general discussions about the music industry and about the role of record producers, because obviously the role of the producers changed a lot in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, simply because the way that the funding structure of the music industry has changed. So obviously we've had to adjust the way that we make records in order to fit with the fact there's smaller budgets and there's a lot more sort of people working at home. There's the whole thing's changed, but we'll have a discussion about that. And then in the second half, we'll have a break about half time. Then we'll do some more of a technical discussion about. I'll break down some Pro Tools files and we'll have a chat through some miking techniques. But really feel free. I always try to encourage a lot of question and answer stuff because that's all the interesting things happen, is how you get your questions answered. And I learn stuff about you learn stuff about me, and I could just sort of rabbit on for hours about stuff that I've done. But if we have discussion, then we all learn more. So it's so feel free at any point stick your hand up and ask a question. But I'll give you a bit of background first. Unlike a lot of record producers, I started off life as a musician as opposed to working in a studio as a T-boy or a sort of tape op. I mean, that the traditional way of record producers back in the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s was you'd start off making cups of tea for everybody, and then you'd graduate to being a tape op. So you'd sort of look after the tape machines, do all the lineups, and then you get interested to maybe engineer a few vocal sessions, a few bits and pieces, and then you'd graduate up to being head engineer, and then on to being a record producer. I came a different route to that. I started off life as a musician, and I did a lot of touring as a drummer back in the sort of in the 80s. I started playing in the sort of late 70s, and I did a lot of touring in the sort of 70s, 80s. But I'd always enjoyed the process of being in the recording studio. I always found it kind of fascinating. So whereas a lot of musicians I knew, they'd go into the studio, they'd play their parts, and then they'd go home. I'd always sit around at the back of the room and watch the producers and engineers working, because I was always fascinated by the process and how songs were built up. And I always found it a bit magical, where you'd walk into a studio on the first day and there would be nothing, and then at the end of the day you'd kind of, all this sort of stuff had appeared from the ether. It was just had this kind of air of magic about it. So I would just sit at the back and I'd watch all these guys work, and say, oh, that's something I think I'd like to do. And I always had in the back of my mind, I didn't really start making a good living at music till my late 20s. So it was like, I can play for all my musical career, but I can't, the industry is very focused on youth, and it's like, I thought I'd like to find a way to stay involved in the music industry beyond, as I get older, so I can always be involved in it, because it's something that I really wanted to do. So, well, maybe record production, engineering, that side of it would be an area that would interest me. So in mid-1980s, I formed a production company with a couple of other musicians. was a guy called Tim Lewis, who was he was an old school friend of mine, and he actually went on to be the keyboard player for Spiritualized and Coil and a lot of really cool sort of synth artists. And he collected lots of old synthesizers, and we had a little Fostex E16 in his flat, and it was the first time you'd actually record at home. It was the first time there was anything that would fit into the budget you'd have to actually buy something to record at home. Because before that, studios were just incredibly expensive places with equipment that was far too expensive for anybody to afford unless you were a sort of rich rock star, really. So we learnt a lot about recording on this little 16 track, and we'd take it out away to other studios and record drums, and kind of what people do now. You go somewhere, you record drums, you go back home, you work on stuff at home. It's kind of the early stages of home recording, really. And we learnt a lot just by making lots of mistakes and sort of moving EQ knobs around to see what happened, and a really minimal outboard. But we learnt the process, and the process was just like, it's the same for whether you're on a little 4-track cassette machine or whether you're on a 48-track sort of two machines locked up. It was all the principles were always the same. So we learnt a lot about sort of recording, and we spent a lot of the 80s just sort of fiddling around in this little home studio. And so after that, I wanted to sort of I spent a couple of years touring, and then there's a band I was in who had a few hits in the States, and they wanted to record a second album. And it's like, well, why don't we just buy some equipment and we'll do all the demos at home, just set in one of the guys' houses, do all that. So we put a little setup together, and we demoed this album at home, and but the band were kind of falling apart. So I'd spend a lot of time in the studio on my own because the guys had fallen out; they wouldn't want to be in the studio together. So I started doing some stuff of my own. So I started doing a bit of dance music. I sort of started doing a lot of programming, a lot of MIDI stuff, and I eventually got a sort of a deal with FFRR, which was like a dance label in the UK. And I'd never really done dance music before, but I quite enjoyed the programming side of it. So I was trying to keep building up these skill sets from, being a musician, then being a programmer, and then I got into songwriting. I had a publishing deal with the EMI Music for 5 years, just doing a lot of songwriting, go around the world, working with other songwriters. So that was another skill set that was kind of important. And then in the mid-90s, I was doing a little bit of engineering at a recording studio in Cardiff, and the owner came to me one day and said, well, we're actually the studio's going bankrupt, do you want to buy it? And it was like, so I started chatting with a friend of mine who was also working there. So we managed to put together the £8,000 we needed to buy the studio out, basically to pay off the owner's rent before the bailiffs came and took all his stuff. And so we bought this little studio for £8,000. And then within a year and a half of buying the studio, we had over 1.2 million record sales from this little studio, because we just happened to be there at the start of the explosion of Welsh music in the mid-90s. So we had the Manic Street Preachers, we had Catatonia, 60-Foot Dolls, Super Free Animals, and they all came in and recorded with us. And the next thing we knew, we had this really successful little studio. There was actually still only a Tascam MSR 16, so it was a pretty basic format, really. But we had a lot of sales, and then one day the knock came on the door, and this guy in a suit. He was like, "Oh, we've come to knock the studio down. This whole area's been redeveloped, so we want to buy the studio. You've compulsory purchase. We're going to buy the studio off you, and you've got no choice." So, all right, okay. There were rumors it was going to happen, but it happened one day, and so we started negotiating with them about what the studio was worth, and we got into a 2-year negotiation about the value of music, and it was a real eye-opener, because I suddenly realized that society in general at that time placed no value on music as a serious profession. And so we had a sort of 2-year legal battle to decide what the value of this little studio we bought for £8,000 was, and what value 1.2 million record sales has to a country. And it was stressful, but it also changed a lot of the mindset as far as like local government and in the Welsh Assembly government changed their mindset about what the value of music was and the inherent value to a country. And a small country like Wales, you know, a bit like Slovenia, you have a small musical community, but the value of it is really important. And all the money that it brought into the country, the value to the country of the profile it brings, having successful artists. And eventually, we actually settled for nearly £200,000 for this £8,000 studio that we bought, because we actually proved our case that that music had inherent value. So it was quite an interest. I spent more time in sort of meetings than I did in a recording studio for 2 years, but I learned a lot about the industry and about ways how important the sort of the perception of music is. So anyway, we went through this, and then luckily, because of all the record sales we'd had, and because I started doing production for bands like the Manic Street Preachers and Catatonia, I managed to get management, Stephen Budd Management, who were based up in London, and then they started finding me other work. And so really from that point onwards, you know, I became like a full-time record producer. And I also decided that I didn't really want to be an engineer anymore, because you know, I never really wanted to be a recording engineer. I just learned it because it was the cheapest and best option, because I didn't have to pay anybody else to do it. And I thought it was a really good skill set to have. So really for the last kind of like 5 or 6 years, well, no, 8 years really, I've been working, you know, with other engineers. Although I try and like sort of mix a few records every year and try and keep my hand in at engineering, I found that the art of production is something that is what really interests me. The time spent with musicians and the time spent sort of arranging songs, and for me is, you know, the more pure form of production than just sitting down pushing faders around. Although that's an important skill to have. So really, kind of that's where we are. You know, that's how I got to this position I am. You know, I have been really lucky in the fact that you know, I've had those breaks that, you know, a lot of it's just timing. You know, I'd been working for you know 20 years before I actually had a really good break as far as, you know, working with artists who became really successful. So, and I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But all the things I'd learned up to that point, kind of all fed into that. And so it's like the beauty of record production for me is something that you're always constantly learning. And every day I'm in the studio, I still learn something new. So it's and it still keeps me excited. So I still enjoy the process, and I still enjoy spending time with musicians and you know, the magic that happens in a recording studio. Magic's an overused word. But it's, you know, it's important. I mean, we get into music for pretty much for 2 reasons. One is because we all love music, and you know, we get inspired by it, you know. And the other reason, probably to get girls, because we were bad at sport. You know, I mean, I know I was. It was like, how can I get girls to notice me? If I play in a band, maybe it'll happen, you know. So, but now now I'm older. This is just the music. But so really, that's where I am at the moment. I'm still making records. I'm still enjoying it. It's still a fascinating thing for me. And so what I think we'll do for this first hour or so is we'll normally question and answer stuff happens at the end, and I find you get to the end of a thing, and everyone's got loads of questions, and you sort of you never got enough time to answer everything. So if we just start off and get a few questions going, and then in the second half, we'll break it down and we'll do some technical stuff, but pretty much anything music related, production related, and you know, anything you'd like to ask me about any artists I've worked with, you know, feel free to sort of stick your hand up and ask me something. I know everyone gets shy at the start. Who wants to start me off? Come on, your whole room full of people. Someone can ask me something. James can ask me something. There's one. Steve. You think of one soon, James. Yeah, it's kind of everything really. It's like really location for recording is really important, and the studio you use is really important. Like I've always been of the mindset that you pick your studios to complement the record that you're making. So every studio you use will colour the sound of the record you're in. You know, the equipment you use. I mean, this is the Manic Street Preachers studio in Cardiff, where they bought it because they liked it. I mean, I've been doing records there for 15 years before that, and they put this beautiful old Trident desk that used to be at Rockfield Studios in, and lots of amazing records were done on this desk, like a lot of the Rush albums. Farewell to Kings was done on here. All the Adam and the Ant stuff. A lot of the Cure records were done on this desk. So it's got a real history. I think there's a few Bohemian Rhapsody channels in there as well. So it's because it was all built out of parts from that were lying around Rockfield Studios, and it's been in about 3 other studios, this desk. So I often pick that room because it's got a really great live room. I often pick that studio because it's good for putting people in a room and playing, you know, and getting really live, aggressive recordings. But also it's in the middle of Cardiff, so it's like it's quite a, you know, it's not so you go away for a long period of time. I tend to do kind of shorter sessions there. Whereas if I'm doing an album, I'd like to get people out of the city and into the country, because there's too many distractions, especially if you're recording in London. It's a nightmare. It's like every band member's got somewhere else to go. They've all got to, you know, their mate's playing a gig, or they've got to get home because the girlfriend says, you know, you spend too much time with those musicians, you want to spend some time with me. And so I tend to get them away, and I found a lovely studio right in the Cotswolds in sort of about an hour west of London. And it's a little town full of old people, so there's no distractions. So it's a really good place to record. So it's one of the main things with recording these days is the budgets that we've got to use are so much smaller than they were even 5-6 years ago, because people download things for free, and so obviously the business model's changed completely. And you know, we'll have this discussion about downloading and about the internet, and about, you know, I'm actually really positive about it, but we'll have this discussion over the next few hours. But I've had to find a model where I can record albums really quickly, and I found by getting people away from home into places where there's no distractions is the best way to do it. Basically, just lock the musicians away for 3 or 4 weeks and make the record, and you don't come out till it's done. And it's and it works. And you know, I've been turning albums around in like 20 days, including mixing, which is pretty quick. But to do that requires a lot of organisation. So I spend a lot of time in discussions with the artist before we start. I have a really tight team of people that I know can work fast, and we put a lot of hours in. I mean, not stupid hours, because it's actually self-defeating. If you work more than 12 hours a day, it kind of defeats the point of doing it, because you'll work less hours the next day. So you just try and have a routine, and the routine's really important. And if you do that, you can get through a lot of records in quite a short period of time. But the key is to make the records what I call financially transparent. So you want to put the record on and never use the excuse, we didn't have much money, because you shouldn't be making the record if that's the case. So you need to make records that if you had 10 times the budget, wouldn't sound any better. And that's become the sort of the art of production these days, is making records that sound like $1 million on a shoestring. I mean, comparative shoestring. You know, I'm lucky in the fact I don't have to sort of sit at home with a computer with no DSP that doesn't work very well. You know, I get to go to quite nice places to record, but that studio time is really valuable, and you know, you need to it's important you have a really knowledge of that how inherently valuable that studio time is, and use it properly. But yeah, so it does completely affect the. You know, luckily the last couple of years I've done some albums in some really nice places. We went over to Black Rock Studios in Santorini, did some recording over there, and it's very lovely. It's swimming pools, and you know, the vocal booth that looks over the Aegean Sea, and there's ships going past, and it's real nice. But it doesn't make the record sound any better. It's still like, you know, singers still sing out of tune, guitars still play out of time, you know, drummers still moan, bass players still do too many drugs. You know, musicians are the same wherever you put them. If it's a Greek island or in the middle of a city. So yeah, it's but yeah, location's important to answer your question. Thank you, Tim. James, you're going to ask me a question? The pitch, yeah. It's become all important, really, because whereas what used to happen a lot is record companies would go to producer management companies and say, we need a producer for this record, and you were dealing with labels all the time. Now it's like you're pretty much dealing with a lot of managers and artists direct. So you can be pitching up to about like there's the Melanie C album I did for My Sins is I was pitching with 17 other producers. So it's like, well, how are you going to get the job? There's 17 people going for the gig. What can you do? So I thought, well, I'm probably not going to get the job, but I'll do the best pitch I've ever done. And so at least I'll say to my manager, oh, he didn't get the job, but he did a really good pitch. So I spent like a week. It was a pretty hard week listening to every Spice Girls record, every solo record, every watching gig. Yeah, well, it was nice watching Jerry for a week, but yeah, it was. But I thought, but actually, by the end of the week, I was like, actually, there's some really good songs. There's some really good ideas, and I got past all the sort of like the perception of it. So probably, I don't know if you know mine and James's history, but I produced James's band in about 95, 96. So that's how we know each other. So that's why I'm here. And back then, everyone would say, if you got offered a Spice Girls record, would you do it? So of course I would, but you'll never get offered anything like that. But yeah, so the pitch, I spent a lot of time preparing for pitching because there's a lot of competition now. And a lot of the producers who were getting the big label gigs, they're all pitching for the same jobs now because there's less money out there. So you're doing a lot more private clients, a lot more sort of private investment, venture capital, rich parents. The rich parent gig has become a really, really important part of making records and sustaining record producers. Yeah. It's the middle class end of music, whereas music used to be like boxing. How to get out of your life in the sort of inner city of Manchester. You became a boxer or you joined a band. Now because you're now affluent parents and now in bands. There's been definitely a bit sort of move to the middle class of making music. I mean, I don't want to get into the political discussion of it, but it's really changed, and a lot of my clients have been the wealthy parent funding the record because either they were a musician themselves, or they just want to. It's a natural parental thing. You want to support your children and do the best for them, but then you end up with the terrible, what we know in the trade as DMs and MMs, the dad manager and the mum manager, who are just the worst nightmares because obviously their son is the best songwriter since John Lennon. And their daughter is the new Kelly Clarkson or something, and it's like it's tough, you have to get through their, it's like if you see someone with a particularly ugly baby, you can't say your baby's really ugly. Oh, aren't they cute? Aren't they beautiful? And yeah, so there's that syndrome. But it's you've got to approach every record with care and attention, and you can't, everyone's who's making a record is serious about what they're doing. I mean, if they're not, I wouldn't work with them anyway. So I spend a lot of time having meetings, talking to people, having dinners, and pitching for jobs. But I always say at the end of pitches, it's like, if I'm the wrong fit for the record, I'd rather not do it. The worst thing you can do is do a record that you don't think that you're invested in, sort of musically, that you can actually bring something to. You've got to really feel that by you being involved, you can make the artist better than they would have been if you weren't involved. And if you can't answer that question, if the answer to that question is no, then just don't take the job. And the hardest thing for a record producer is to turn down a job. Anybody who makes a living in the arts and is self-employed will find it hard to turn down work. But you need to do it sometimes because your legacy is the body of work that you have, and you've got to stand by that. And And there's no hiding anymore. You know, if someone wants to work with me, they'll jump online and listen to stuff that I've done. You know, so hopefully, if they don't think I'm the right person, they won't approach me in the first place. But if they do, then I'll look to do the best job I could possibly can within the confines of the budget and the, you know, and the songs that we've got to work with. But also, if they're not very good, you've got to let them down gently and say, I'd like to do something, but maybe in a couple of years' time and these are the areas I think you need to work on. And they'll probably hate you for it, but it's ultimately they'll thank you for it. But it's yeah. So the pitch is everything, and I know a lot of great producers who find it hard to get work because they're just not very good at pitching. And I spend a lot of time trying to perfect that skill. You know, of meeting people, talking to people, and just trying to be sociable and try to be a decent person and treat people fairly. And they're pretty universal things, but they're important, really. You know. Who else has got a question? Here you go. Yeah, all the time. It's yeah. I mean, no two sessions are the same. You know, if you get an amazing drummer coming in and playing, you're not going to need to do much to them. But especially with bands, especially with young bands, I'm really against the idea of bringing in other musicians to play, because the whole idea of a band for me is the way they interact together, the good players and the bad players, the way they, you know, can you imagine like the Stones without Charlie Watts? You know, can you imagine like the Beatles without Ringo? Yeah, I still think the best drummer for Oasis was the first guy they had, you know, because he wasn't great, but he had a really good kind of lazy sort of lolloping feel. Yeah, but I mean, me and Lars, we have issues. You know, I've always, it's been a long-standing hatred between me and Lars, and reinforced by that scene where he's selling his artwork in some kind of monster film where I actually wanted to jump through the TV and kill him. But he is a really integral part of the band. So I always try to, you know, sometimes that involves what me and my engineer Clint Murphy call workarounds, where we find ways to make not great players sound good. And with drums, we got a couple of little tricks, you know, like you can break the kit up into so you can get someone to do. One of the biggest problems tends to be drummers playing 16th note hi-hats, kick and snare, and nothing connects. So like everything's flamming with everything else, and so we'll do the kick drum parts, and then we'll do all the top kit stuff. And the kit sounds pretty tight instantly after that. So, and the same with, you know, with bass, little workarounds as far as doing things in smaller sections, and sometimes you've got to do that. Much as I'd love to put every musician in a room and get them to play together, they're not always capable of doing that. And there's often a mindset with musicians of, it's the classic, a lot of young bands come to me and say, can we do an album to tape? And it's like, then I have to go to this long conversation about how recording to tape is not a recording, it's not a recording medium, it's a state of mind. So do you realize you can't change anything? You know, your mistakes will be there. We can drop bits in, but it'll never be as, you know, it'll always be what it is. So well, you know, I often say, well, let's record something in the room and see what you think. So you put some mics up and you play, you know. So I always start a session with the musicians in a room playing together. Even if we're going to go back and retrack everything else, because that's how I look at the song arrangements and the tempos, and they often come in and go, oh, you know, we don't sound like we do live. And it's like, well, no, that's how you sound. That's as tight as it. That's, you know, you've got a great headphone mix. You've got a great, you know, that's what you sound like. Is that what you want to sound like? Can we tighten the drums up a bit? So you know, you once you convince them, then, but usually, ultimately, musicians are very vain, egotistical people, a bit like record producers, really. And we all want to sound good. You know, we want to sound really good. And if you record the drums properly and everything properly and it sounds great, it's like, oh, I sound amazing. I sound great. Look how great I sound. Play it to all your mates. It's like, you know, ultimately that's a producer's role, to make people sound better than they think they sound. But also find that balance between being overproduced. You know, it's like, you can't really win, because things you make are either in people's minds are either overproduced or underproduced. And you got to try to find that balance. And I just say to people, listen to what I've done. If you think it's overproduced, don't come and use me. If you think it's underproduced, go to something else. If you want something else, go to somebody else. This is kind of what I do. I like drums to sound nice and tight. I like vocals to be in tune. But one thing that I'm really strict about in the studio is any changes that are made in the computer have to be done by hand and not done by the software. So if we edit in drums, you only move things that need moving. You don't let the computer decide what's going to move. And with vocal tuning, you only tune things that need tuning. You don't let the computer algorithm decide what it's going to tune. So that way, by making myself or my engineer or our assistant have to do things carefully by hand, they'll only tend to do the minimum amount of work just because that's the human nature. You're not going to do everything if you don't need to do it. So every snare drum sample is put in phase by hand, lined up with waveforms. It's a really laborious process, but it makes you think twice about what you're doing as far as editing stuff's concerned. There's yeah, I never do it myself. I get someone else to do it. But it's one of the world's we have a thing we call the shit jobs list. The shit jobs list includes lining up drum samples, comping backing vocals, which is just the world's worst job, and yeah, actually they're the most, and making the tea and coffee obviously, but yeah, putting samples on, lining up things, comping backing vocals. I'll never let assistants comp any lead vocals. I like to be there for all the lead vocal comps and everything. So I subscribe to a couple of theories. One is the Steven Spielberg theory, which is like, if you can find a shortcut and still do it well. Like there's a famous story with Spielberg with Raiders of the Lost Ark. Have you heard the story? There's a scene where they're having a big fight in the marketplace, and this guy dressed all in black with a big sword turns up, and Harrison Ford just takes his gun out and shoots him. The story behind it is they were 3 days behind with filming. Harrison Ford had dysentery, and they were meant to have this massive fight scene. And Spielberg said, "Look, just take your gun out and shoot the guy." So, and by shooting him, he saved. They got this filming back on track again, and it's one of the best scenes in the film. So that's the genius of Spielberg. And so, if I'll often say to my engineer, just Spielberg it. Find an interesting shortcut that'll be just as good, but not. Why do 10 tracks of backing vocals when one might work really well and actually sound better? So, and the other theory is the Richard Branson theory, which is you don't have to do everything yourself, but as long as you have really good people involved with you and you can sort of monitor what they're doing, so just keep an eye on what they're doing but not watch over their shoulder all the time, you'll get really good results, because people like to have freedom to be able to interpret things in their own way. And rather than be like a sort of always trying to get people to do things my way, I'd rather get good people to do things their way and see if I like it. So I'd rather me sit down and arrange string parts for a whole day. I'll bring in a great string arranger to arrange the parts. Someone who I really trust, who I've worked with a lot and built up a relationship with, and same with engineers and musicians as well. So, and the more I do production, the more I trust other people to, because it's like, if you don't trust other people, there's a lot of really talented people out there, and you need to give them freedom to be able to do things, and it's now a lot of us spend time at home moving a mouse around, moving samples around. It's like you kind of lose the sort of the heart of making records, which was people in a room interacting, discussing it, creating. It's become a more solitary profession, which I don't really like. I like you turn up to work, you play, you record music, and then you go home, rather than just lose your whole life staring at a screen. And I purposely don't stare at screens all day, because I was brought up recording to tape, and I like to listen, and so I'll either turn the screen off, or I'll sort of not have the screen in my line of sight, so I can't see what's going on. And often I'll have a discussion with my engineer, who you'll say, "This bit isn't right." I'm like, just close your eyes and listen to it. Can you hear the edit? And you never can, but you can. If you see it going over the screen, you'll hear it, because it's like psychoacoustics. It's so yeah. So I can't remember what your question was, but hopefully I've answered it. Yeah, cool. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah, I mean, there's a level of expectation now where record companies particularly want things to be, they won't accept things that are loose. They won't accept vocals that are out of tune. They won't accept a lot of the things that we used to take as part of the recording process. So yeah, it has changed music a lot, and I think, recently I've made a few records where I've deliberately tried to kind of use the techniques that I used to use when I recorded to tape a lot, which was, and I'd go back and listen to old recordings that I'd done, and I said, well, why do I like that? What's magical about that I feel I've lost now? I think when I first got Pro Tools, it was very much, I'll put a vocal down, yeah, we'll sort it out afterwards, Whereas with tape, you were always focusing on what was happening at the time. So I thought, well, I need to apply those techniques to the way that I use. So recording is just a recording medium. So let's try and use the same techniques. So, like with comping vocals, I'll still do the thing where you have 6 takes and you sometimes still comp on faders, but you still use your comping for like performance and tuning and all the things you would have done if you couldn't alter it afterwards. And then you just use any software and algorithms to kind of like just tidy up as opposed to like fix things. So often you can just comp a whole vocal and you haven't got to touch it with anything because it's in tune, it's in time, it's So, but it's all about finding the best performances as well, because it's like you tend to see this. If a guitar buzzes, you clean it up. You put a fade on. It's like, but that was kind of like the part of old records that was fun. Hearing amps buzzing and things clicking and things a little bit sort of loose, and that was kind of the magic, and that's what's been lost a bit really. This kind of music's lost its heart a little bit. So, but saying that, it's also by having lost, like especially with like a lot of electronic music, the beauty is in the sort of tightness. It's in the fact it's really angular, and listen to like Depeche Mode record or something. It's like there's something still magical about it, but in a different way. Or a Kraftwerk record, going back even further. It's like there's something beautiful about the starkness of it. So it's just making those musical interpretations all the time, and the thing with music, there's nobody's right and nobody's wrong. It's all just your own personal interpretation of it. Like I hate Lars Ulrich's drumming, but a lot of people really love it. But it's just my personal opinion, and I'm not right. But in it, what's that? Yeah. I mean, Lars would argue with me, I'm sure, But, so, music is one huge grey area. And this is one of the biggest problems of being a record producer or involved in music is you might do something you think, God, this track's amazing, it's incredible. And you play it to someone and they go, oh, that's a pile of shit. What was that, You're like, what? It's amazing. Can you not hear it? And somebody else will see something in a different way. And you can't argue with it. You can't say, you're right and I'm wrong. Because nobody's right and nobody's wrong. That's just the nature of music and any art. Like my wife drags me to art galleries every now and again. I look at things she likes and I think, oh, that's horrible. Why does she like that? And she loves it. And it's like music is art. And music is the only true art. It's the only thing that doesn't copy anything else. And it's always going to be open to that level of interpretation. And then then you have to deal with someone at a record label who has no idea about music. And it's difficult, But often, you do need someone who has no idea about music to actually tell you if that's the public opinion, as it were. It's like I've had record labels come to me and say, that's the first single. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. And they were right, because they saw it in a different way than I did. Because I was affected by the fact that you know, the song was hard to record, or, you know, it was like they couldn't get the vocal right, or the mix was terrible. And it's the same with, like, with when you're picking songs for an album. Like, one of the big way that music for me has changed in the last 5-6 years is we used to record like 20, 30 songs for an album and pick the best ones. Now you have to pick the best 10, 12 songs and just record those, because there isn't the budget to do those. You know, there've been Manic Street Preachers albums where we've recorded like 26, 27 songs. I mean, they all see the light of day eventually, but you have that luxury to be able to do that. Now, most artists I work with, you know, we barely record more than 12 songs for an album because it costs a lot of money to record the songs. So you're trying to pick the songs, and it's and musicians are affected by things that are not connected with how good the song is. It's like, well, I don't like that song. Well, why don't you like that song? Well, it's about when the bass player in the band stole my girlfriend, you know? It's like, or it's an old song. That's the classic one. It's an old song. It can't be any good. It's old. It's like, well, you know, that you're saying that all Jimi Hendrix's back catalogue is rubbish because it's old, you know? It's like songs shouldn't have any sort of like time limit. And so really, you know, I'm affected by a lot of the things that musicians are affected by with the recording process. So sometimes you need that outside perception to be able to tell you, you know, actually, why do you look at that song again? Because actually it's a really good track, you know. So, but that's the beauty and the curse of music, is that no one's right and no one's wrong. So we're all right and we're all wrong. So you know, I think it's very easy to get defensive about the work that you do, but sometimes you've got to take criticism. The only reviews I ever remember are the really bad ones, because they're funny and you look back at them and think, well, it's just one of my reviews said, even the silence between the songs sounds overproduced. And I kind of wear it as a badge of pride now, because I really love that review. I couldn't possibly tell you. No, it was the Mel C record, reviewing Q magazine. And I had 2 albums reviewed in the same month, and with a total of 3 stars out of 10. Yeah, it was not a good month. I didn't buy Q magazine for 2 years after that. It was for 2 albums, yeah. So out of 10, 3 stars in total. It was pretty bad. It was a bad month, because I thought they were good records. And I mean, both those records sold really well. So ultimately, I had the last laugh, I suppose, really. But you know, that's just reviewers' view. It's like, you know, you can't. People say, don't read your good reviews and don't read your bad reviews, but I can't actually remember that. There have been good reviews, but I only remember the bad ones. Maybe because they inspire me to kind of go on and like, you bastard, I'll show you. You know, not you, obviously. Some more questions? Go.
How do you approach a mix if it's the point is, do you mix every song from scratch? Let's say it's some generic metalcore band or something, right, that's, you know, it shouldn't supposed to have a different sound for every song.
Well, as far as like, should you treat every song differently? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Do you start from scratch, and you know, do you save that and keep?
All right. Yeah. Well, there's a couple of ways of looking at it. I mean, if I'm mixing, I tend to do everything from scratch. But I've had records mixed by guys like Chris Lord-Alge and Spike Stent, and especially with Chris's mixes, he very much has a way of doing it. He has a sound, you know. He's mixed tens of thousands of records, and he's had more hits than that, you know. And the good thing about his mixes is when you get them back, and it's like, oh man, I sound really good, you know, because he's a great mixer. But his mixes do sound the same, and he has a very specific way of doing things. Like he never touches any of the buttons on any of the compressors. He'll buy a new compressor and slot it into the rack and use that, you know, so he doesn't change anything. So all his snares and all his snare samples are the same, but you go to him because he brings a specific thing to the mixes. I find that a little, you know, it's not the way I would tend to do it. And also, more and more these days, I've kind of not been mixing records myself. I've been getting my engineer Clint Murphy to mix records, because he's a fantastic mix engineer and he makes everything sounds great. So, but I always try and have that before I play a note is played on a record. I want to know what what the path is to the end of the record. So I'll know what studio we're going to be in, what engineer's going to track it, what engineer's going to mix it, who the master and engineer is. So I know the whole chain of people, because they all colour the record. So if I'm going to use a certain master and engineer, I'll know how much compression we're going to use, what we're going to do, and I'll actually involve the master and engineers in the process. So about sending some rough mixes over, and it's like, is there anything you think we can do to these to kind of, so rather than like, I finished the record, shit, we better get it mastered. It's important to keep that part of the chain. It's a really vital part of the record. So although I do have like systems in place as far as mixing records, it's more about who's going to do it as opposed to what.
But I meant for one specific that has a more sound.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. No, I mean, no. You can get one of the ways to save time is if the sound of the record is pretty much consistent all the way through, your drum sounds are going to be the same. I mean, on a lot of records I do, we'll group drum sounds into, like, all these songs will have a specific sound, and then all these. So we track those together, and then we mix those together, because it does save you a bit of time. But yeah, I mean, there are records you can make where you get the first mix sounding right. I mean, the first mix, the equation we look at tends to be the first mix should take twice as long as the second mix, and the third mix should take half as long as the second mix, and then all the rest of the album. Because it's just that first mix always takes longer, not just because you're trying to experiment and find what the sonic should be, but also you want to get the artist's input early on as well. And if you give an artist one mix, they'll pick holes in it instantly. If you give them 5 mixes, they'll be, they all sound great. It's because they get so focused in on one thing. It's like, oh, is the hi-hat in the second verse too loud? I always try and encourage people to take a step back when they're listening. It's like, if you put this mix on, listen to it like someone else would listen to it. Pretend you're not on the record, which is a really hard thing to do. And because you listen to someone else's record, you don't tend to think, oh, that bit of vocal there, or that snare drum there, or it's a piece of music, I don't know if James remembers my Curry theory of music. Do you remember my Curry theory of music? Right, I have this. It's one of my favourite, one of my theories. So the Greg Haver Curry theory of music. If you make a curry, like sort of, Indian food. You make it all, and it's all little ingredients, onions, peppers, whatever you want to put in it. And you make it, and then you eat it straight away, and it's like, oh, it's really nice. There's some onions, some peppers, and the next day you eat it. It's like it just becomes a curry. You don't taste the individual ingredients anymore. It becomes this kind of whole, and mixes are like that. You listen to them straight away, and you're focusing on these little things. Is that ingredient in there? That thing there? Is that thing? And then the next day you put it on and go, oh, right, that's just a stereo mix. That's the song. It's And they settle overnight, and all the things you're worried about. I don't know if you've ever done that thing. How many people in here are engineers or producers? Yeah. Oh, it's a fair few. You do that thing where you put 10 mixes down, you listen to the next day, and they all sound exactly the same. Yet you've made these little tiny fader moves, and it's like they don't mean anything. So a really good way to approach it is to push all the faders up real quick. So you're not like kick drum, EQ, snare drum, just push everything up, and then just start. Everything has to interact with everything else. So it's like a good snare sound is only a good snare sound if it's right in the song, and if it works in the song. I often solo things. It's like, God, that sounds terrible. What was I thinking? Then you take it out of solo, and it's like, right, this sounds great. That's what we were thinking. That's why it sounds like really shitty on its own, but it sounds great in the song. So everything. I approach that when I'm tracking as well. It's like there's no point in I'm not one for fix it in the mix and don't worry, we'll get some plugins going on, it'll be fine. And I always put down sounds that I want them to be, because the drum sound will affect your bass sound, will affect your guitar sounds, your keyboards, your vocals. So everything's got to work in relation to each other. So even now, annoyingly, my engineer will say, oh, what do you think of that keyboard sound? I'm like, just play it in the song. Contextualize is what I say. It annoys him. But I say it because it annoys him. Because we're like an old married couple and we fight all the time. But it's like, contextualize, because it's like, without it, this means nothing. A good sound is only a good sound if it works within the confines of the song. So, and everything's got to support the song. Nothing should just be there because it's a cool thing. It should be there because it makes the song better. So, but those, I mean, those are all things that they're interpretive. You a different producer do them in a different way. But these are things you just learn by doing it a lot. I made hundreds, probably thousands of records now, and I learn something new on every record. And it's it's an ongoing process, and you'll never stop learning. And that's what keeps me doing it. Really, is just that sort of I've never done that before. That's great. Happens every session. It's brilliant. It's always a great moment. Yeah. Oh, I think if it's their record, ultimately as a producer, you're there to support the artist's needs and not your own. So it is their record ultimately, but you also need to protect them from themselves. Vocalists tend to can I have my vocals a bit quieter, please? And that the rec company are going to say, can we have the vocals a bit louder, please? So you have to use your experience to kind of find that middle ground. It goes back to compromising. Music is inherently a compromise. If you're a band, you accept compromise as part of the thing. There's 4 or 5 of you, and you all bring your own things in, and you all have good points and bad points. So it's a compromise. If you have a solo artist, it's harder because they often have a vision in their head of what they want it to sound like, and your job is to try and translate. So what you're trying to do is not only take what they've got in their heads, but make it better than they thought it could ever be. And that's the and the only way to judge that is to have an open conversation with them and include them in the process. The only time I ever kick people out of the studio is if I'm comping vocals, because I want vocals to hear the comp when it's finished, so they can say to me, "Well, actually, that line's not right," rather than sit there and listen to the same line 10 times on different takes and get all panicky because one bit's out of tune. And I encourage people to be around for mixing. I prefer it if they are, because it's easier. It's like, we've got a mix on, have a listen. Oh, that guitar part's did we do? What's something wrong with that guitar part? And often they'll pick up things that you didn't notice, because you get so involved in the process. So I'm not one for nodding. I always try to include the artist as much as possible. I always tend to be on the side of the artist rather than the side of the record label. I always fight the artist's corner rather than the label's corner, because the label should have signed the artist because they like what they do. And so you want the artist to be able to go and promote their record that they're happy with. So I'll often fight their corner with their management or their label and stuff. But usually, if they're happy, ultimately the people involved with them will be happy as well, because they're not getting their ear bent all the time about how something doesn't sound right. So yeah, I'd always include people. And it's hard because some people are idiots. Yeah, but a lot of making records is about personality. It's about dealing with people. It's 50-60% psychology making a record. Like if you've got any ability as a producer or an engineer, the record should sound good, because there's no excuse for it not to. I mean, equipment's really great these days. Mics are really good. Cheap mics are amazing. Like when I started off, unless you had like a £2,000 Neumann, things would sound rubbish. Now you get like a sort of £100 Neumann copy from China, and it sounds incredible. And it's like, but also always try and make things sound right in the room. If you're standing next to a drum kit and you think, oh, God, that sounds real good, put some mics on it, it's going to sound real good. If you stand by it and it sounds like a piece of shit, then it's going to sound like a piece of shit with some mics on it. So, and same with guitar sounds. Guitar sounds are slightly tricky because you stand in a room with a guitar, and you play it, and it's like, oh, that sounds awesome. Because I like to have amps super loud recording, even if they're clean sounds, because I like I want to smell the valves kind of cook in, and everything feels warmer and a bit earthier when it's loud. But then you walk into the control room and then you start listening back to a set of NS10 speakers. It's like, oh, it doesn't sound like it does in the room. It's because you're surrounded by this kind of 3-dimensional thing when you're standing in front of an amp. So translating guitar sounds is always a bit trickier. But saying that, if the sound coming on the amp is good, then you've got to sort of, and the same with with any instrument, you know, if it sounds great in the room, you know, you should be able to translate it pretty easy to record in. A couple of years ago, I did this. How we're out for time. Has anyone got the time? Oh, great. So I've got another like 20 minutes. Another 20 minutes. Then we'll have a little break. A couple of years ago, I was recording down in New Zealand, where I go quite a lot, and there was every 7 years, Neil Finn from Crowded House brings a lot of musicians over to record an album for Oxfam. He's got the Seven Worlds Collide project, and he brings in guest musicians to work on the first one. Eddie Vedder was on the first one, and I think he did contribute to the last one as well, but just, like, not in the room. But he brought, like, Johnny Marr from the Smiths came over, and Phil Selway and Ed O'Brien from Radiohead, and Katie Tunstall, and all the guys from Wilco. They all came over, and they had 3 studios going, and they had a producer called Jim Scott who did a lot of the Chili Peppers records. And I was there mixing the week before, and I said to Neil Finn, any chance I could sort of come and hang out? He said, yeah, come in, just come and sit in, just, you know. So I spent 2 weeks just wandering around these studios, watching all these incredible musicians play, and I realized it was like, and all Jim did was just put a couple of mics up, like, you know, a couple of mics on the drums, and everyone was such amazing players that whatever he did, it sounded incredible. It's like, oh, that's what music's about. It's about really good people making really good sounds and not doing too much to it. And it really opened my eyes as far as what was achievable and why the performance in the room was much more important than trying to fix things afterwards. And it was a real eye-opener. And plus, I was like a total fanboy, you know, standing around chatting to Ed O'Brien and Johnny Marr about guitars. I'm like, oh my God, this is so exciting. I was like really sad fanboy, you know, chatting to Johnny Marr about Smith's records. It was like, oh my God, this doesn't get much better than this. And the guys from Wilco were incredible. Jeff Tweedy and all those guys. They just made a beautiful sound. They could pick up anything, like the shittiest bass or the crappiest acoustic guitar, and play a chord in it which just sound like heaven. You know, it's like, oh man, just good players. It makes your day. You know, same way the bad players can really ruin your day. So, but yeah, that was really kind of made me rethink how to do things, and this is why I wanted to spend more time with musicians and less time behind a mixing desk, because it was all about trying to get them confident and getting them sounding really good and feeling comfortable to play. You know, because a confident musician will play really well. If you tear somebody down in the studio, they won't play very well. You know, so you've always got to spot the strong members of bands, the weak members of bands. There's always somebody in a band who is the cocky little shit who comes in, is like, not every time, but often. Yeah, this is what I want to do. I want the drums to sound like this. I want the guitar needs to be like this. And it's like, and you think, right, so you're the guy that can't play then. And you can guarantee that when he comes to do his part, he'll be the worst player, the least confident. And he's using this whole thing to cover up, you know, his cocky shitness, to cover up all his insecurities. And so you spot him straight away. It's like, oh, right, I'll be watching you. So ultimately, I get the last laugh because I can put him through hell. But so, you know, you kind of need to spot this. And often there's the kind of the quiet person. Does anybody know what? Has anyone heard of oblique strategies? Yes, it's these were cards developed by Brian Eno, and it's like you pick a card and you do what it says on the card. A band gave me this as a present. I found it before I came over, and there's one card here that says "Listen to the quiet voice," and there's always one person in a room who doesn't say anything. They sit at the back of the room, and often they've got the best idea, but they've been so beaten down by the other band members that they're frightened to say anything. So you kind of like go to them, and often they'll come up with some really cool idea. Mark Roberts from Catatonia was like that. He'd never say anything, and he'd say one thing, and it would be the best idea of the day. Like, always be fantastic. Why didn't you try this guitar thing there? Or why didn't you just do that? But there's all kind of crazy shit on here that's that if you're Brian Eno and you're making Coldplay records, you can afford to do, like things like Erase and Start Again and all that stuff. Right, let me find a few of these. They're pretty funny, some of these. is work at a different speed. There's one that says drink water, which I always quite like. Faced with a choice, do both. That's one of them. Emphasize the flaws. This my favourite one is honour thy error as a hidden intention. That's a particular favourite one of mine. What have we got? Do something boring. You know. So basically, you just pick a card, and they do what's on the card. It goes back to all the sort of stuff he did with Bob Fripp and all his crazy stuff, but he still uses them apparently. So because there's lots of Coldplay stories about sort of how for the first week of making a record with him, he won't let Chris Martin in the studio because he's such a big personality, stroke wanker, that oh god, I've blown my chances of Coldplay record now, haven't I? That he keeps him out of the studio and lets so the rest of the band members can actually express their own voices during the writing process, you know, which is a pretty brave thing to do. I couldn't get away with that. I get fired. I have this recurring dream that I get fired by Chris Martin all the time. I've had it about 3 or 4 times now, and it's like, you know, when I eventually get the Coldplay gig, I'm going to get fired because it's come out in my dream. But yeah, so Eno's got all these great sort of ideas, and he's made some incredible records. It's like, you know, all the Bowie Berlin period stuff is all genius work, you know. So whether you like Coldplay or not is one thing, but you should go back and check out his you know, a lot of his Eno's back catalogue, right back to Roxy Music and all that stuff. It's really interesting. But yeah, the Oblique Strategies cards are pretty fun. You can get it as an iPhone app as well. So it's but the cards are kind of nice. A band brought it me as a present. It was thought it was quite a nice thing. But they said I wasn't allowed to use them on their record. So a couple more questions before we have a break. And then we'll look at some files afterwards. Yeah. I'm an overproducer, something that people say because they feel that the songs have been altered more than they'd like to be. There's no, you know, what is overproduced. It's like, it's kind of an excuse. It's like saying a record's lo-fi. You know, it's like, well, you mean badly recorded. You know, it's like it's the opposite of lo-fi basically. It's like, yeah, you know, yeah, a good one. Yes, it's all interpretive again. So it. Yeah. I mean, to be fair to Q Magazine, I did feel some of the tracks on Melanie's record were, but a lot of that was down to pressure from labels. There was a lot of the demos that were very much super programmed, you know, and I want to try and get it back to a kind of a raw rock thing, which is the original brief I was given by the label, and but then there was decided to kind of go back to a lot of the programming that happened on the original songwriter demos. So, yeah, and it's and I've been trying though to sort of like, you know, what makes a timeless record, you know, and it's like I've been thinking a lot about how to make records that you don't put on in 10 years time and think, oh, I mean, that sounds a bit dated, you know, like, you know, sometimes you get the advantage of like I made a record, actually the one we're going to look at the Pro Tools files on, where the artist wanted to make a record that sounded like it was made in like 1992 or something. So it was like, so we actually used a lot of the production techniques that we did back then, and but I'll go into all that when we break it down. But he had a very conscious. The brief was, I want the record to sound like it was made 20 years ago, and it was really interesting to do. You know, it was like because I remember it, because I was recording records then. So I remember the reason he did the record with me because he's much younger than I am, and he knew that I was there at the time, and he wanted to make the record like that. So. But it's very much of its time. So you put it on and think, oh, right, that sounds like a 20-year-old record. So it's trying to make records that feel a bit timeless, that the sort of you can put on like a Rolling Stones record, you put it on. Yeah, it sounds a bit kind of rough, but it's kind of still has something. Or like Led Zeppelin albums are a great example. You put them on, they still sound amazing. They still sound incredible. And that's down to the players in the room. It's not necessarily down to the recording technique. It's like, you know, you've got an amazing drummer like John Bonham, who makes a drum kit sound beautiful. it'll sound great. It'll still sound great in 100 years' time. You know, it's just making those records that sound timeless. And I feel that a lot of there'll be there's definitely a sort of people are pushing back against like a lot of a lot of editing, a lot of computerized music, and I think that the part of that is wanting to make records that feel like you can listen to them in 30, 40 years time and they still feel relevant. Whereas if you've got something that's like like super processed, it's always going to sound of its time, really. So like sort of mid 90s pop records, they were when they were made, because they sound like that. Without orders. Without anything, November. I did. I went over to New Zealand and recorded an artist called Katie Thompson. It was kind of a little bit sort of alt country. And the idea was we were going to do a four-track live EP off the floor, and maybe I'll play you a bit later, and then do 3 singles like we did her previous album, like go in and retrack everything and stuff. And we did this live EP, and we just loved it so much. It was only meant to be for sort of she does a lot of fan funding. It was just meant to be sort of a bonus thing for her fans, and we liked it so much. That's the record we're going to put out. It was just the 4 of us playing in the room, live vocals, live acoustic guitar, bass and drums, all at the same time, no overdubs. And it was like, and we literally learnt the stuff. We had the demos from Katie, just the songs. And myself and Andy, the guitarist, we flew in on the Wednesday night from the UK to New Zealand. So we were pretty jet lagged, and we got in and we filmed and recorded all this and learnt the songs the next day. And that's the EP. Just probably because we were so tired, it had a nice feel. But I should be able to, if I can get online, I can maybe show you a couple of tracks, because there's a few of the. But it's really beautiful. It was just. You listen back, it was like, and Kate's such a wonderful singer that it was like, her vocal sounds beautiful. So kind of like that kind of makes it. If the vocal was rubbish, it wouldn't really work. But the vocal's so good that it's like, it was great. It was really enjoyable and really easy, because we did it in an evening. Just recorded some songs in an evening. It's like, if you could only record every record you did in an evening, think how cheap records would be to make. But I love that we did 3 singles as well, which we tracked over a couple of days, and they sounded really great too. But it was a very different thing, It was almost like I preferred the simpleness of the straight off the floor live recordings. So one way of getting around, there's a middle ground where you could record, which I did with the band recently, where I recorded them live, but I did like multiple takes to the same click track. So you had like 4 or 5 playlists. So you could kind of like put in maybe a verse from one take, chorus from another, but it was still them all playing on the floor of the studio. That was a nice way of working as well. So I'm trying to find new approaches that kind of retain some of those, that initial interaction in the musicians. So I still make a lot of records that have heavily tracked up, and so it's trying to tailor it for each artist, really. So everybody wants a different record. So and that's how we did that one. It was good. It was real nice. Yeah. Well, with EQ. Yeah, I think it's best to use no EQ at all if possible. Like what myself and Clint do a lot of is use the characteristics of the microphone and the compressor and the mic pre's to colour the sound. So, say for vocals, we have a chain of maybe 3 compressors. So maybe like an 1176 with a fast attack just to pick up the transients. Something like a Teletronics or LA2A or something for a really soft, and then slam it into like a TG limiter that really brightens the sound up. And it gives you a lot of sibilance and transient, and then a little bit of de-esser, and it's great. So really, and we don't use it all we do with vocals is shelve everything below, say on a female vocal, everything below 80 hertz out, because you don't need it. It's one of the biggest things that I notice when people give me home recordings to mix. They put a mic up and they just leave it. They leave all the or if you're recording a voice, there's no real low ending. There's nothing below 160 hertz or even 80 hertz with a female vocal. So just get rid of it, just shelve it out, and do that before you hit the compressor, because the compressor is trying to compress stuff that's not there. So you'll never get that clarity. So yeah, so cut stuff and don't EQ things, and just use the mic characteristics. It's so easy just to go for EQ. You know, you put top end in stuff. Oh, it's great. It's got top end. It's like playing songs faster or in a higher key. It feels more vibrant because it's faster or because it's brighter, whereas it's not necessarily the right thing to do. It's like radio stations always want to speed songs up because it's faster, you know. But let's make it even faster because it sounds even better faster, you know. This is a great story about Jason Pierce from Spiritualized, where he took the mixes over to some holiday place in Spain or something, and he had because he liked the stereo there to listen to the mixes, and then he kind of cranked all the top end into the stereo, and then he phoned up the mastering engineer and said, buy one of these amps and analyze it and find out what frequency that is and boost that frequency. And so so they did it, yeah. And then he went back to Spain again, then he cranked it all in again. So it was like, yeah, and then do the same thing again, you know. So just like endless top end EQ because it sounded brighter, you know. So through all the drugs and craziness, you know, it sounded better to him. But it's not necessarily it's not a great way to do things, you know. It's like if you can avoid using lots of EQ and stuff, that is, it's cool. Should we have a bit of a break? Yeah, because you know, thanks for listening to me rabbit on for ages. Maybe come back in about 20 minutes and we'll look at some technical stuff and think of some questions as well.